Honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Hear, hear.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Appreciate it. Thank you. It's always a pleasure to rise in this House and have your say about certain topics, and certainly the SDTC scandal is one that has rocked this chamber for a long time now, and rightly so. But Speaker, before we get to that, if I might, I want to just speak a little bit about Lloyd Cody, who's a veteran in my riding. Lloyd Cody will turn 100 years old on November the 16th. And I can remember clearly when I had the opportunity to be the honorary colonel for the Nova Scotia Highlanders. Lloyd and I, one Remembrance Day, were standing on the dais, and you know, I can remember him asking me if he wanted to have a push-up contest. And I politely declined. And then as we stepped down off the dais, Lloyd then wanted to have a running race. And once again, I thought that would be rather impolite to do so. But that being said, needless to say, Lloyd is in incredible shape and certainly an incredible guy. He was a medic during World War II. And God bless you, Lloyd, and many more. And I hope to see you before Remembrance Day this year, and of course on Remembrance Day as well. So Lloyd Cody, what a guy. You know, that being said, I suspect Lloyd would be aghast with the details of the Sustainable Development Technology Canada Fund. You know, when you begin to look at this, a whistleblower testified before the Industry Committee in the fall of 2023. And I can remember my great friend from South Shore St. Margaret's telling me about this scandal day after day after day, and building this case, which he's been so successful at, and understanding that $400 million of money has been actually given to Liberal insiders. But this whistleblower in the fall of 2023 accused the federal government of having carried out an egregious cover-up. And of course, that's part of the reason why we are here today. Doug McConaughey, at the time the Assistant Deputy Minister at ISED, was recorded by whistleblowers saying the following about the SDTC, and I quote, "There is a lot of sloppiness and laziness. There's some outright incompetence, and you know the situation is just kind of untenable at this point," end of quote. The Auditor General's report on SDTC was damning, and it found that SDTC had not set clear guidance to support staff and the Project Review Committee to determine whether a project met all the eligibility criteria set out in the contribution agreements. And of course, it goes on and on and on. And we know that when this was further investigated, there were 186 conflicts of interest. And as I mentioned at the outset, at least $400 million of government money has been given to Liberal insiders, and that is why we're here. You know, it's interesting. I've heard much of this debate, and it fascinates me that it's okay to give some of the information in terms of redacted documents, but the NDP Liberal government doesn't think it's okay to give all of the information in terms of unredacted documents. Now, I don't really understand that logic, because it's, quite frankly, it's not logical. So as we begin to understand that is, in essence, what we're talking about here today, is giving the full amount of information that's available. As I said, it's okay to give part of the information to the RCMP, but it's not okay to give all of the information to the RCMP. If that doesn't make any sense to people, of course, it doesn't make any sense to those of us on this side of the House. You know, I think it's important that Canadians understand the reckless spending causes the difficulties that end up. And I know my colleague just before me answered the question about whether Canadians might consider that borrowing money to make investments makes good sense. And certainly there's been, you know, lots of schemes out there. Maybe that's what rich people do. I don't know. That being said, that really wouldn't make any sense. You know, if you could, you know, borrow money at a low rate, invest it at a high rate, generally speaking, okay. But I don't know who has the ability to access that kind of capital, and what kind of a scheme you would have to be involved with. Maybe, actually, I do know what kind of a scheme you could be involved in. It is the SDTC scheme. That is actually what you could be involved in. If you knew, for instance, that your company was going to receive lots of money from the NDP Liberal government, then it would make sense to borrow money to put into that company because you know that your pockets are going to get flush with cash, perhaps much like the Radical Environment Minister has been able to do. And we'll talk about the Radical Environment Minister a bit more. Speaker, we know that on this side of the House it's important to talk about 4 pillars of moving forward and how we are going to get rid of this corruption. Axing the carbon tax, of course, is one of those things that is part of the core being, and we've asked multiple times on this side of the House for a carbon tax election. And, you know, more fuel to the fire, because we often hear that, of course, you get more back in carbon rebates than you pay in, which I had a very astute constituent email my office, and I thought it fascinating because his quote really cut very closely to the quick to say, only a fool would believe that you're going to give the government money and they're going to give you more back. Who ever heard of such a thing? You know, again, if you could have a scheme like that, I would suggest it'd be something great to invest in. That being said, I think this is more smoke and mirrors and sleight of hand. Yeah, it could be a pyramid scheme like Amway, maybe. You know, if any of you remember those days. But that is much akin to what the SDTC scandal is. Back to axing the tax, you know, the Canadian Trucking Alliance reported in September that in 2024 the carbon tax will add just under $2 billion to annual trucking costs in Canada. By 2030, the carbon tax will add more than $4 billion to annual trucking costs, an overall increase of about 15%. Over the 12-year tax phase-in, the tax will have cost the trucking industry more than $26 billion. And I know for everybody out there who was watching Question Period today, our leader talked about businesses being driven to the United States, and certainly this is another scheme of the NDP Liberal government to drive Canadian businesses south of the border where they do not have a carbon tax. Due to the razor-thin margins in the trucking industry, these added costs cannot be absorbed, and listen to this, Mr. Speaker, they must be passed on to consumers, which leads us to this incredibly important point, which those of us on this side of the House, of course, have said many times, and I know the member from Winnipeg probably wants to join me in reciting it, but when you tax the farmer that grows the food and you tax the trucker that ships the food, then of course the person that buys the food has to pay all those costs as well, and of course they end up getting taxed over and over and over again. The Trucking Alliance also reported that virtually every good purchased by Canadian families and businesses involves truck transportation. And any of you who go anywhere, obviously you see that. I remember a great billboard in the United States that had a picture of a baby on it, and underneath the caption, of course, "This is the only thing not delivered by a truck." And of course, to go on to say, as I mentioned, this means that those families and businesses are paying increasingly higher prices for the goods to pay for this ineffective tax. So this is something that when we knock on doors and we talk to folks, to real folks, as opposed to perhaps some who the NDP Liberals talk to, I don't know who they talk to, but we know that the cost of living is crippling the financial lives of Canadians. We also know that the tax will cost Canadians about $30.5 billion by 2030, which works out to be about $1,824 per family in extra annual costs. And we know what the Parliamentary Budget Officer has said about the damaging and damning carbon tax. In May of this year on CTV's Power Play, he said, quote, "Overall, a vast majority of people will be worse off under a carbon tax pricing regime than without, and we do not expect that to change." I know that the NDP Liberals want to manipulate and change the words of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, but of course that's a falsehood. In his June 3rd appearance before the Finance Committee, the Parliamentary Budget Officer once again confirmed that, and I quote, "The government has economic analysis on the impact of the carbon tax itself. We've seen that, and staff in my office, but have been told explicitly not to disclose it nor reference it." So a damaging attack, certainly by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. You know, what else is going on in terms of the finances of Canadians? We know that Food Banks Canada reported more than 2 million Canadians visited a food bank in March of 2024, which is the highest in the history of reporting. And when you look at that, 2 million Canadians, my goodness, this is a fantastic country that we have. Why is the NDP Liberal government spending money and driving Canadians to food bank? And when we look at Nova Scotia, Nova Scotia's food banks reported 39,360 total visits in 23-24, which is a 21% increase from the previous year and a 53% increase from 2019. And of course, sadly, many of those visiting food banks are children, 32.4%. And you know, I'll interrupt my own self and talk about the school food program, because of course this is a problem that the NDP Liberals have created, and now on behalf of Canada and Canadians, they want to spend some more money to solve a problem that they created by their vanity projects and their spending with abandon. And nearly 30% of food banks across Canada report that they are running out of food. When we look at a report from Dalhousie University, they said that a family of four will see their grocery bills rise by over $700 in 2024. Now, that may not seem, like a lot of money to a lot of people on the NDP Liberal side of the House. Perhaps the Prime Minister doesn't think that's a lot of money. That being said, for those of us who grew up in circumstances that perhaps were not with that proverbial silver spoon, we know that $700 is still a lot of money, and it is something that we need to be mindful of. And while I'm talking about childhood, I'll give a shout out to my mom, who's 91, still living in the same trailer park that I grew up in, and hopefully today she's having a good day. Still living independently at 91, that's certainly something. Hopefully I can repeat that. So as we look at this is the kind of difficulties financially that Canadians are suffering from. Second major pillar, of course, on this side of the House is building the homes. And we know that 70% of those folks who are using food banks in Nova Scotia were residing in market rentals. And when we look at the building permits that have been done in June of 2024, we know that the total value of building permits in Canada fell 13.9% to $9.9 billion in June of 2024. And decreases were reported in 11 of the 13 provinces and territories. I'm sure that's much to the chagrin of the former failed immigration minister and now flailing and floundering housing minister. This was in both residential and non-residential sectors who experienced the reduction, and in a constant dollar basis from 2017 representing 100, the total value of building permits declined 14.3% in June, following a 13.4% decline in May. These are absolutely damning statistics when you hear a government spending absolutely billions of dollars on their so-called housing accelerator, et cetera, and then, Speaker, I guess once again, there has to be a bit of commentary here. I find it absolutely egregious that the housing minister wants to publish names of members on this side of the House who have said that we should not be writing the minister advocating for constituents. And as you look at that, there's no word for it. I don't know if there's a nicer word, but in my mind, it's Bush League. When you write letters to the minister, you would, even if the programs are absolutely sloppy and lazy and poorly administered and wasteful, much like the SDTC, you would expect folks, and I think the Canadians, certainly I know the people who put me here, have an expectation that I will advocate for them, and that the Bush League minister really wouldn't be there going on and saying, oh, that this is something they shouldn't do. I think it would be absolutely fascinating that when we form the next common sense conservative majority government on this side of the House, that every letter written to a minister will be made public, that they are out there supporting the wonderful things that we shall do, such as axing the tax, building the homes, fixing the budget, and stopping the crime. So as we begin to look at those programs, I think it'll be great when, former folks such as perhaps the failed housing minister, but when you look at the polls, he's probably going to lose his seat anyway. Again, the multiple failures, substantial declines in multi-unit construction intentions, down almost 20%. The overall residential decline was led by these reductions in June. And since Toronto signed its Housing Accelerator Fund agreement with this government in December, the number of units permitted is down 23.6%. So as you see, Speaker, this is a sad state of affairs that continues. StatsCan, a report on building permits from August, reported a further 7% decline in the total value of Canadian building permits. If we say that these programs, as they are wont to say, are these incredible successes, why do the permits and building of units continue to decline? StatsCan report, CMHC reported in September that the 6-month trend in housing starts decreased by 1.3%, from 246,000 units in August to 243,000 units in September. This continues on. The same thing is happening in the great province of Nova Scotia. That centres with more than 10,000 people, this building starts declined by 40% between September of 23 and September of 24. So are their programs successful? No. Certainly the program that our leader has brought forward is easy to understand, it's easy to implement. It's removing the GST portion from new builds under $1 million, saving significant amount of money for Canadians. We often, of course, talk about fixing the budget. My colleague has gone on at length about the $1.3 trillion debt and the fact that this NDP Liberal government over the last 9 years has added more to the federal debt than all other previous governments combined. I think that sad statistic speaks for itself. Of course, on this side of the House, we're also interested in stopping the crime. We know that between 2015 and 2023, hate crimes recorded by StatsCan increased by 275%. Police reported homicides increased by 28%. Police reported sexual offenses against children increased by 153%, with 11,503 reported in 2023. There were almost 71% more sexual assaults of all kinds in 23 than in 15, with 36,625 being reported in 2023 across all three categories. 2022 in Canada had more homicides than any year since 1992. There were 439 reports of human trafficking in 2023. This is almost lawlessness. There were 78,849 motor vehicle thefts reported in 2015 and 114,863 in 2023. This is a sad state, Speaker, and when, of course, the leader of this side of the House talks about Canada being broken, certainly I would suggest that Canadians believe when they hear these incredibly egregious statistics. This is really telling stuff, Speaker. We hear the Toronto Police Union on social media on October 21st stating that, I quote, "Our communities are experiencing 45% increase in shootings and a 62% increase in gun-related homicides compared to this time last year. What difference does your handgun ban make when 85% of guns seized by our members can be sourced to the United States? Your statement is out of touch and offensive to victims of crime and police officers everywhere. Whatever you think you've done to improve community safety has not worked." Police unions in Vancouver and Surrey also criticized the government when the Vancouver Police Union tweeting out that the Prime Minister was, quote, "not aware of the ongoing gang war here in BC, which is putting both our members and public at risk on a daily basis." And the stats sadly go on and on and on. Speaker, you know what, as we come to the end of my comments here today on the SDTC, we also know that the radical environment minister, who I referenced in the very beginning, has significant interest in Cycle Capital, and that when you look at Cycle Capital under the leadership of Ms. Metteau, that almost $275 million in provincial and federal money was given to this company, and of course the radical environment minister sadly still has significant amounts of shares in this company. And even though he has been challenged 3 times to come to multiple different committees, he has still failed to appear. And I guess the question remains Speaker. With this privileged debate ongoing and with the Minister failing to appear at committee, Conservatives on this side of the House want to know what is so damning inside those redacted documents, what is there to hide, and when can this Parliament expect to see these documents and be able to debate this further and get back to the business at hand. Thank you very much.